I'm very happy to be closing out, I think, what has been, as usual, a fantastic conference. A lot of great ideas have been raised, and I'm not going to disappoint today with raising far more questions than any answers that I have to give to you, which to me is very energizing because it makes me think of all sorts of research opportunities, that we can explore. I'm going to apologize in advance that I and several others have to catch a flight, so we're going to fly out of here right at 4:30, but please contact me if you want to talk about anything further or weren't able to ask something in the time that we were here. So I'm going to talk about reproductive decision making and the kind of dyads and triads that encompass that. I think 10, 12 years ago, at least when I started this work, and I know many others in the room started it much earlier, we maybe used to counsel in a very different way than we would counsel now. So we would say, you don't need to worry about what you're going to do, maybe just bank now, and worry about it later. And we now know, I think, that that's very ineffective counsel, because this is not a unique decision to be made by the patient alone, and that there are a number of people who may encompass what is considered to be the partnership or the triadic relationship. So in traditional literature, the dyad relationship is between the patient and the healthcare provider. But we know that these decisions are made, thank you. So my goals are to review this literature, the little that we know, and very little that is in reproductive health or reproductive decision making, to look at parent and partner, patient and partner, parent and child, patient and partner, whoever would encompass the group that's the decision making, and then to identify some gaps. And I'm going to close out with some cases that I hope you'll help generate ideas on. And my very last slide is going to be to leave you thinking about some new names. Okay. So just to kind of clarify, there's some terms I'm going to talk about here. Shared decision making, just to make sure that we all have the same definition. It's technically considered a process by which clinicians and patients work together to make decisions and select tests and treatments and care plans, as opposed to substitute decision making, which I've often seen used in the literature with regard to parents making decisions on behalf of children, which is not exactly accurate. So substitute decision making is when the person lacks capacity to make decision making. So such as someone who may be in a coma, or maybe someone who has been deemed to have severe cognitive impairment. Dyadic and triadic decision making, I'll show you on the next slide, can encompass a whole bunch of different players. And then collaborative decision making, which I think is more what we're talking about here, which is recognizing that there are a variety of stakeholders involved in the decision making and that those players may change. And then also talking about reproductive health, I've heard other speakers talk about this World Health Organization definition, which says reproductive health is not just about fertility and the right to choose when and how and in what form children come into the world, but also about sexual health, contraception, quality sexual functioning, and romantic partnerships. And then finally, quality decisions. And so quality decision, I'm going to show you a slide later on, encompasses that there's 9 components of it. It really makes it challenging for those of us who want to do work in decision aid and decision tools, because there are 2 big names in the field, and basically if you don't follow every one of those 9 steps, you probably won't get funded and you probably won't get published, that what you're talking about should have the word decision in it at all. But in general, a quality decision is one in which a patient lacks regret, lacks distress, and is satisfied with that decision. And it's amazing the number of times that all of those things don't equal. So a patient can say, I regret the decision I made, but I'm satisfied with the decision that I made given the information that I had at the time. So there's all sorts of combinations that encompass the dyadic and the triadic decision making. It could be the patient and their parents with the healthcare provider. One of the challenges that I hear a lot from the oncologists, particularly adult oncologists who are now in the position of treating the adolescent young adult patient, which they did not necessarily have training for. Whereas I think the pediatric oncologists do a much better job of treating the AYA patient because they learned in their training with how to deal with the parent as a partner. So I've had many oncologists say to me, this guy comes in, he's 25 and he comes with his parents, and I just want to kick those parents out of the room. Like, what are they doing there? And not recognizing that they are the equivalent support person as if that person, came with a spouse. But it really challenges them with how to deal with them, because they are acting like a parent despite the fact that the patient is a young adult. So as I've heard Jessica and some others, going to talk about what we know, and maybe we should qualify all of this with what we may know, because I don't think we really know anything for sure. But in general, the triadic communication in medical encounters is perceived as helpful but challenging, and the onus is really on the health professional. So many studies that have looked at this type of decision-making and many systematic reviews have said that in order for it to be effective, it's really incumbent upon the healthcare professional to make sure that it functions properly. And we know we put a lot on, particularly on oncology providers, and I think to come say, future decision-making about reproductive health really rests in your hands is not going to go over well. But in general, we know that parent-teen dyads prefer to make their decision-making with the healthcare professional, and parent and child and parent and teen dyads feel the same, even when there's a poor prognosis and when they're planning palliative care. So in these kind of dyadic relationships, they'll have conversations in the home, but it's rare for them to want to do anything that they don't feel that they have the support of the provider in doing. And so I was thinking about that also as I was listening to the financial toxicity and maybe answering my own question about how might these data compare with countries where this is available and it doesn't cost anything and people still aren't using it. And one of the things that I think might be a factor is the way that it's presented to them. And I've been in the room, and maybe you have too, but I know I haven't been in the room with any of you, so I won't be sharing something with a provider telling a patient, you could do fertility preservation, but you don't have time, so I don't advise it. So that's not really an open door message to explore that possibility. It's the same when providers taking a health history and they say, you don't smoke, do you? So if a patient does, they're not going to want to it's easier to just shrug your shoulders at that time than to come clean and talk about getting help. So again, not putting down the oncologist. There's a lot that's going on. And a lot of this has to do with their own values and what they perceive that the patient may value, which may be long life or over, some of these other things that they consider secondary to curing the cancer. But it's interesting, though, that couples or partnered relationships, they view shared decision-making as occurring between them, but also with the physician. So there are several mandates out now, for example, the new lung cancer screening. And one of the requirements in order for Medicare to pay for that is that there has to be evidence of shared decision-making. And so this is evident in a lot of CMS-type language, but without any criteria for what that means. So what does shared decision-making mean? I hand you a pamphlet, and I say there's some benefits to getting lung cancer screening, but there's also some risks. So is that a shared decision-making, or is it according to the decision-making literature that we'll look at that involves 9 steps, in which involves me as a provider giving you really specific information that's tailored to you and your situation. So yes, you quit smoking and it was 10 years ago, but you have asthma and you have claustrophobia, so I maybe don't recommend this spiral CT for you, for lung cancer screening. So a lot of these things, are not well defined. But I think what we know about reproductive health decision-making, and this has been covered by a lot today, we know that patients experience regret when they don't receive this information, that patients who do receive the information, regardless of whether or not they uptake it, have improved quality of life, that patients perceive that fertility is an important part, but not all of reproductive health, and many times that can impair their decision making. So you can imagine if you are a 16-year-old girl who's never had a romantic relationship and you're asked to think about fertility preservation, you might be thinking more today, well, I've never had a boyfriend, and as I've heard, one young teen say to me, I have all these scars, my hair has never grown back properly from when I was 9 years old. I'm damaged goods, who's going to want me? So it's very challenging to think about having a baby, in the future, and all of those things can impact making a decision about something that you're asked in a short period of time. What's also, I think, interesting, and other speakers have alluded this today, we've done some pilot work at my previous institution, those large numbers of misperceptions that are evident among adolescents and young adults about their cancer. So they know that in general, less than 10% of cancers have a hereditary component, but 90% of patients in this age group diagnosed with cancer think that there is. And so a lot of those people are what I call silent sufferers. They won't even tell you that's what they're thinking. You'll ask them about fertility and they'll say no, because I don't want a child to go through, they won't say this, they'll be thinking this in their head, I don't want a child to go through what I'm going through. And so we definitely know that we need to do a better job of giving people that information up front, so that even if they don't verbalize that, we can take that off the table if it's not something they need to worry about it. And if it is, and they need genetic counseling, they can learn about PGD and PGS and other ways to mitigate if that's a potential concern. And also has mentioned today, so it's just a further emphasis of the euphemism, great minds think alike. I haven't heard anybody say anything that contradicts someone today. Contraception is a really important part of reproductive health decision making, but it's rarely discussed and it isn't uniform. And we've had patients who've been told you can't be on any form of LARC while you're undergoing radiation, and then others who say you can, and they get a mixed message. Or the biggest mixed message is, I spent a lot of time talking to you about fertility, so that means I shouldn't worry about contraception, and because it's not brought up. And also, again, as we've heard today, body image, self-concept, sexual functioning are all things that are not discussed. I think an important part of all of this, too, as we're exploring about reproductive health and as society is changing, it may seem kind of tangential to this, but it's important, is that it's relatively rare for institutions to collect sexual orientation and gender identity data. So the Meaningful Use Act, or the Health and Human Services, said that we had to have electronic medical records, and we had to build a place for the collection of these data, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to collect it. And as we all know, like many other things, it's not being collected uniformly. So it's very hard for us to give perhaps a transgender patient with a cancer diagnosis or a lesbian couple information about, or a lesbian woman, how this cancer may affect her sexual functioning, or a gay man with the way that he prefers to have sex, because we don't have data on this. So our lack of inability to collect data makes us challenged to give evidence-based direction to our patients. And we know a lot of physicians would rather say nothing than say something that's just based on opinion, or their value, or the reverse. They'll say what's their opinion without any evidence. So I think a lot of the things that we really don't know for sure are several areas that are inconclusive, is teen decision making. So the literature has really supported the idea that parents should and can make decisions for children younger than 7. So they talked about creating an open future for children, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But also that some of the things that we don't know, kind of going outside of the cancer world, we don't know if all of this evidence that we've collected about wants and needs and desires and wishes, how much of that is transferable to other conditions that are being treated with gonadotrophic therapy. So do people with lupus, who maybe don't have to have a life-threatening decision, do they think the same ways about this? And should we talk to them about it in the same way that we talk about a cancer patient? Do parents of children and children themselves with gender dysphoria or DSD, do they have similar thoughts and concerns? And are the tools that we have in the oncology world relevant to them by maybe just changing a couple of names? Do we have good tools to help the extended family make decisions? Because if you have a young person who maybe isn't partnered, and even if they are, there might be, if they're lucky, because there's also people who are very alone in that situation, they have a lot of people. They've got parents, they've got grandparents, they've got friends, they've got partners who all want to be part of the care and planning of this person. And how much of information do we share in front of this extended family? So the patient advocate alluded to this a little bit yesterday. So we think maybe that our partner is going to be our partner for life, and our friends are going to be our friends for life. And we say, you can say anything in front of them. You know, I'm an open book. But maybe if that partner is no longer our partner in 10 years, we don't want them to know that information about us. So that's really challenging too. It's kind of like talking to the newly engaged couple that's so excited and saying, have you thought about a prenup? You know, you're asking people to plan for the worst when they're in a situation where they do feel very supported by this person. And we also know, as I said in the beginning, that we can't just tell people to just do this and worry about it later. There are many cases, and at this conference and others we've heard about them, about the partner agreeing to the use of the embryos in perpetuity for the cancer patient and then rescinding that agreement, and battles that happen even when cancer isn't part of the diagnosis. We know that posthumous reproduction is an issue for people who tend to go underground if they do it. So if another person's thinking about it, it's challenging for them to find information about that decision making because they don't know anybody else who's done it, and people don't talk about it too much because they get a lot of pushback from society about that. The same for surplus embryos and surplus eggs. So there was a New York Times report that came out a couple weeks ago that made an estimate that there were over, I can't remember now if it's million or billion, so I'm going to use the lower number, 30 million eggs sitting on ice that will probably never be used, either because the patient didn't live, if they were a patient, or as we see for people doing social egg freezing, they decide by their mid-40s that they don't care to be a single parent and they haven't found a partner, or they naturally conceived. But all of these couples will tell you either they'll just continue to pay the bill just in case, or they'll just stop paying the bill, so that the choice of what happens to that tissue or those gametes becomes somebody else's decision and not theirs. Last year or the year before when I was here, I showed a video by a very brave woman on YouTube talking about the challenge for herself to discard of the embryos that she had created after she had completed her family, and the huge backlash that she got from people when she decided to allow them to thaw. So these are things that we don't have the answer to yet, nor do we want to bombard a cancer patient making these kind of decisions and say, what if you get divorced? What if you have too many? What if you don't use them? It's just too much to think about, but at the same time, we can't not tell them that these are things that are part of decision making. So as I said, parents deciding on behalf of a child is definitely supported in the literature, and I think nobody needs to worry about that. And many of the bioethics type literature talk about creating an open future for reproductive capacity. But the challenge is the teens. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the many ways that the Oncofertility and Teresa has supported, and that has really been kind of game-changing for me, is having the opportunity to do this funding to get funding to adapt the Wenzel's reproductive concern scale for young girls. And we, from that, developed the values clarification tool, which is not a measurement tool to measure should this person do it or not, but it's to help the young person and their family and a mental health professional talk about this. And so what we found with that is that there's great discordance between teens and their parents about these reproductive concerns. So almost uniformly, a mother, because they tended to be, I think we only had one father in the study, would say, my child cares very much about that. And when we talked to that teen girl alone administering the scale, she didn't care about it. Or they would say, and this is also shown by James Klosky in boys, my son, my daughter does not care about this, and then that teen ranked it as a very high priority. So again, as we've said many times in this conference, it's not something that's necessarily discussed a lot, and people are maybe projecting that I just care about the cancer, so my child must just care about the cancer, or I really want grandchildren in the future, so my child must care about having a child. So it's challenging to think about parents making decisions for teens with cancer when we know that at least now there isn't a good track record and there's not a lot of data on the whole kind of stakeholder decision making of the young person in which many people might be involved. So some of the models for negotiating decisions that have been done in pediatrics, and again, this shows how the literature is pointing that the onus for good decision making happens on the part of the provider. So there's three kind of models that are suggested. So one is the deference model, in which the pediatrician prioritizes the parental decision making authority and says, you guys are really the ones to decide and you should decide. And then the advocate model, in which the pediatrician is advocating for the child and for the child's role in the decision making and having a voice. And then finally, the one is the arbitrative model, in which the pediatrician works to resolve the conflict in a balanced fashion. And I think that's probably the goal of a lot of mental health professionals and their training, to take time to do that. But I don't see the oncology world taking on that arbitrative model, in these types of decision making. And it's not so much that there's discordance or disagreement, but there's maybe one member of the group, maybe the teen, doesn't need as much information as the parent does, and the parent wants more and more information and needs that in order to feel good about the decision. So this is just one of several models, none of which have been designed for reproductive decision making in the triadic approach: the provider, the patient, and a parent or partner. And then again, the reverse of that, some may argue that those decisions should not be, the provider should not be a stakeholder in those decisions, that it's completely up to the patient or the teen and their parent, or the child or the parent on behalf of the child. So in talking about what are definitely, I think, some needed areas of research, is how to support parents. We know that they can. We know that the literature at least supports the idea that they can do that, but how to help them balance the harms and benefits. At another meeting, I talked about some case study work that I had done with parents who had made the decision to store or not to store the gametes of seriously ill children under 3. And what struck me was the parents who were both physicians, of a little boy who was 2 years old with a brain tumor, and they really wanted to do testicular tissue cryopreservation, but he went downhill very fast and they couldn't find a place in time to do it, or he was not transportable and there wasn't one in their area. And afterwards they said how relieved they were that they had not done the testicular tissue cryopreservation, because they said we would have felt like we needed to have a second funeral. And it reminds me, the case of another father who contacted the Alliance for Fertility Preservation recently and said, I battled for custody of my son's sperm. He was 16 when he banked. He was, I can't remember, in his early 20s when he died. I have it. I don't know what to do with it. Are there any support groups that I can go to talk about this with other people? And I think somebody queried him, like, well, what are you thinking? He's like, well, I'm thinking I should have a funeral for it, or I'm thinking I should hire a surrogate and get a donor egg and create a grandchild. All of these thoughts are, but it's the last thing in my mind, in his mind, that remains of his son, and it's challenging to me to not spend a lot of time thinking about it. So how do we support a parent, and when do we support them? At the time when they're at the clinic signing forms and making these decisions, or at some other time when it's better for them to hear that? How do we support patients and couples making posthumous reproductive decision-making opportunities? Storing eggs or embryos or sperm, knowing that one partner may not survive, but them deciding that the couple deciding that a child will be born hopefully in the future. How do we address this unique dia, which is very challenging to the adult oncologists who have no training in pediatrics, to deal with what's a quad relationship of the adolescent young adult patient, let's say who's 30, who has a partner, but the parents are still very involved in the care. I was just reading some transcripts the other day about a study that we did where the girlfriend of the patient said, I would like to be alone with him when he comes out of surgery. We have some things we need to discuss. And the mother said, that's my baby. Until you have a baby, you won't understand. You will not be alone with him. In fact, I'll consider if I'll even allow you to be in there. His father and I will greet him when he comes out of surgery. So that's kind of, something, unique that a child or an adult becomes a child again and very fortunate to have so many people looking out for them, but also creates conflict for the partner who can't possibly have been with the patient as long as their parents have been. And who knows, what the patient wants, but don't want to hurt mom and dad's feelings by saying, yeah, I really would like to have my girlfriend there instead of you, and don't want to hurt the girlfriend's feelings either. So again, how do we counsel patients and partners about the disposition of unused gametes? And I think and we don't need, I wrote clear goal, but I was thinking about this last night, it doesn't need to be clear. Is the goal of us as a community of caregivers and researchers uptake? I mean, are we at a point where we can say we know it's best for men or boys to sperm bank or women to freeze eggs or tissue? Or do we care about decision-making satisfaction? Do we care that we gave the patient and their stakeholders all the information that they needed to make the best possible decision, and using a term from clinical trials, that we adopted a form of equipoise where we don't care what you decide, but we want to know we gave you all the tools to make the best decision. So this is a kind of a review of the criteria of a decision aiding tool and what it's supposed to do. So the point of decision making is supposed to help the patient understand the probability of each outcome. So in this case, for example, to preserve or not to preserve. Examining the utility of each outcome and then combining it with the probability for each outcome. So these are all information that we're probably never going to have. I mean, we can give you general statistics, but in order for this to be a true decision aid, and I'll review some of those, I'll review those 9 terms, we have to give that patient data that's based on their particular case. And so many of our young adults have a really unique or a rare cancer, and we've seen this with Immerman Angels and other entities. We can't find someone who exactly matches you, especially with a Foundation 1, and you may be an N of 1 with what you have. So we can't really give you data that's really specific to you. And also, as many of us have been talking about in the past couple of days, numeracy, which is a form of health literacy, is meant to be considered. People have a variety of ways in which they interpret data and statistics. So I can say you're 40 years old, and if you freeze eggs, you have a 6% chance of having, and someone could say, they could interpret that to mean I have possibility of having 6 children. People hear what they want to hear, and if they're an optimist, they make the best out of it, and they're a pessimist, they make the worst out of it. So these 9, sorry, I skipped ahead. So there's 9 characteristics for something to be a true decision aid, which I think makes it challenging for us to create decision aids and tools, but shouldn't prevent us from doing so. So it should be given in addition to counseling. It is not meant to be a tool that someone just goes to a computer and reads the information on their own. It should be related to a specific deliberative choice, not something that is considered standard of care. And so that's another reason why in this domain it may be challenging. Related to, it should describe the options and outcomes specific to the person's health status. It should be sensitive to their literacy, which includes not only their health literacy. You've heard me talk about the case of the patient who attempted to file a suit against the medical facility for not telling him that he might be unable to have a child in the future. And it never made it to case, but in the risk management mediation, they said, what did you think when you were told that you may be sterile as a result of this treatment? He said, I thought it meant I would be very clean. So we really can't be sure what patients are understanding, and maybe don't have a lot of time to do a huge teach back for a lot of these things that we think are standard, which makes it challenging. And so sensitive to literacy, numeracy, and culture. It should provide information on the specific condition, the outcomes and probabilities that are tailored to that patient, information on the experiences of others, which is kind of combined with number 8, which is values clarification exercise, so giving people scenarios to work through or testimonials of other patients that are varied, and then generally provides guidance on the decision-making process and the communication. So that's a tall order. So consequently, there are also 9 steps to kind of thinking about an ethical case, and in these next couple of minutes, I want to review some cases with you, very informally. I don't have the answers. There are no correct answers, just people's thoughts on that. But these are some cases when I used to sit on the ethics committee that came through one or more ethics committees. So these are real people, but these are not their real photographs up here. So just to kind of think about, so if you're deciding on an ethical case, you have to gather the facts of the case. You have to decide what the ethical issue is. And those of you who sit on ethics committees probably are well aware that like 90% of the cases that come to ethics committees are really not ethical issues. It's mostly a healthcare provider wanting support for a decision that they've made, or a patient or family member hearing conflicting information from one or more providers. You identify the stakeholders, identify the consequences, identify the obligations, which is sometimes considered the 4-box method, thinking about the principles of autonomy, beneficence, maleficence, and justice. And then also important, considering your own character and your own integrity and what values you are bringing to the situation. So I know in thinking about some cases that have come before the board, if they challenge the values of one of the board members, for example, who's a strong evangelical Christian, or someone who's part of the LGBT community and the complaint is about a person who's from that community, you can have a strong personal reaction to that, which can make it challenging for you to really give a unbiased judgment. And then deciding on, as an ethics committee, we don't say what things should be done. We provide, recommendations, which are not laws or even guidelines. So in this first case here, which I'll describe to you, and you tell me if you need more data to think about these things and think about who the stakeholders are, and if you were a provider in this situation, how you might react. So this is a person with stage 3 cervical cancer. She's 30 years old. She identifies as bisexual, and she's currently in a relationship with a female partner, but she has a soon-to-be ex-husband, but currently legally married. Her own parents are divorced, and her mother fully accepts her sexual orientation and her decision to do egg freezing, but her father does not. So her goal is to freeze her eggs with the goal of her partner carrying a pregnancy in the future, because part of her treatment is going to eventually be a full hysterectomy. And in the event of her death, she's already decided she wants to will her frozen eggs to her partner, her female partner, not her currently legal husband. So obviously she's a legal adult. She doesn't need her parents' permission, but she does want their help financially, and she does want their support emotionally. So if you are the oncologist or the reproductive endocrinologist in this situation, how comfortable do you feel proceeding with this? Or what kinds of questions do you feel that you need to ask of the patient, or guidance to offer her, support groups, things that you would want her to think about? Or do we not think about anything because she's a 30-year-old woman and these are her choices? Yeah, do others feel the same?
I agree.
Uh-huh.
I agree that I would get a legal opinion because if people take these around.
Okay.
Proceed with creating an embryo, you have to ask about sort of inheritance, sort of what that child would be.
The inheritance issues.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I would have to question the inheritance issues. Like I would get legal counsel on that.
Nods don't need microphones. Anybody else want to?
Okay. So, again, as I said, I don't have an answer for this. I can tell you what she did and, can kind of help you understand, the circumstances that led. And I'm not sure that there really was a role for anyone to intervene, but ultimately she did not get any financial assistance from her parents. She financed the costs, though, with the clinic. Her partner successfully carried a pregnancy with donor sperm. And the grandmother was permitted she would allow her mother to see the child, but she would not allow her father to see the child because of the lack of support that she felt that she had during this decision-making process, which also had implications for the marriage of her mother and father. And maybe you could argue like grandparent rights for that father for the child in the future. So these things are all really complicated, and try to look how might we have helped this situation in the future. They were offered family counseling and they declined it. The father declined to go if the female partner was going to be present, and the female partner declined to go if her father was going to be present. So and they also declined couples counseling. So my experience has been when people make up their mind about this, they don't want to be derailed in any way. I also found that with the genetic study that we were doing, like what people understood about genetics, the adolescents and young adults with the cancer diagnosis. And several of them said, yes, I was referred for genetic counseling based on the presentation of my cancer and my family history, but I didn't go because I plan to have children in the future, and I don't want somebody to tell me something that's going to make me change my, decision. And, that's your choice. You're not, the law does not require you, to go do this. So here's another case. This is not a cancer case. So this is a 17-year-old who identifies as a trans woman. She's considering surgery and considering gender-affirming hormones. Her own biological father's deceased. Her mother remarried. So her mother is in support of Casey making all the decisions that she wants to make, but the stepfather's not supportive of the surgery or the hormones. And she was offered fertility preservation, but again, her stepfather, who's also her legal father because he adopted her, is not supportive of this.
I would tell her to wait until she's emancipated. At 18, I know that the gender dysphoria might be a lot for her, but to avoid sort of any disruption with her family dynamics, I would just tell her to wait until she's 18.
Mm-hmm.
So, we see these cases a lot, and most of them, these kids don't want to pursue fertility preservation, and many times the parents are very concerned about that. And I think the most we can do is provide education. I think, for some people it's realistic to wait to start hormone therapy, but the majority of people, that would be really difficult. A lot of times they've been waiting a long time before they even seek care or present to care. And, you know, with the self-harm rates being really high and suicide rates being really high, I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind. So it's not a benign thing necessarily to wait, which is also why we take on a lot of potential risks in using these hormone treatments without knowing the long-term outcomes, not just on fertility, but in other areas also, and just have to do a really extensive consenting process about that. And ultimately, in our practice, we do a lot of education. We counsel. I tell them about all the fertility implications, give them a couple weeks to think about it, and then we move forward. But oftentimes what I'm telling the parents is that, you know, when it comes to sperm banking, for instance, you need a willing and active participant. So at 17, it's really difficult to not respect that. But we worry a lot about potential regret in the future.
Are they offered family counseling?
I do not think that they were, no. Yeah, they, but it was challenging because, so in privately, when Casey was alone with the, I can't remember, I think she was speaking to a surgeon and a psychiatrist at the same time, she expressed a great desire to do this fertility preservation, and she wanted to, is there a way for me to do it without my parents being involved? And so that was a concern, you know, for the providers. There was some talk about her potentially, because this was a reproductive health issue, that she might be able to make the case as an emancipated minor, but nobody was really sure. And obviously the other aspects of her medical care, her parents would have to sign off, and people just felt like, you know, they wanted to pull back. But ultimately, you know, Lena, it was very much, I think, like you said, that you see in your cases. So because she lacked that emotional and financial support, she gave up because she's like, this is just one more hassle and it's derailing me from my ultimate goal of achieving, and I'm already upsetting my parents enough, and so I'll just drop it. You know, sounds like she probably is a candidate who's going to have a regret in the future, but you know, the providers in the scene were also worried, did we do everything we could at this time to make sure she and the family had all the information that they needed to make the best decision? And I don't think that they felt that they did, but it was just huge uncharted territory.
Hi, I had a couple questions. The first was, could this patient be considered a mature minor? That would, like, so that you could not have to go through legal means to emancipate, but just sort of be declared a mature minor and be in charge of her own medical care?
Someone else may know. I don't know the answer. I'm going to say that varies by state. But I think when it comes to, so it's not like going to get contraception or going to get an abortion. This is something that's not covered. You need your parents' money.
Right, and you brought this up, Gwen, the point of when it comes to reproductive decisions in all states, as far as I understand, minors are allowed to make their own reproductive choices. But as Dorothy Roberts rightly points out, often that has to do with just negative reproductive rights and not positive reproductive rights. So negative rights to not get pregnant, to terminate a pregnancy, but it has nothing to do with positive rights to carry a pregnancy or to preserve fertility. And I think that's the problem there, is that we're so focused on preventing pregnancy that we don't look to providing it. And I think a case could have been made for saying that if we're going to allow minors to be emancipated when it comes to reproductive decisions, we have to include fertility preservation as well.
So another aspect of this case, it was just my own thought, it didn't come out. So one of the reasons that she expressed desire to do this is because she said, and I remember this was also a line from the movie The Danish Girl, she's like, because I hope one day to be a real woman and carry a baby. And so I'm just wondering, for those of you who are reproductive endocrinologists and who would like basically be consenting a person, would you still move forward with allowing that procedure to continue with this, maybe at least right now in 2017, something that's not a possibility?
So by possibility, we mean a natural-born male being able to carry a pregnancy. So there are uterine transplants, right, that are available, and the group in St. Louis and Cleveland have done several transplantations, and the European groups have done several transplantations. So it is a potential option for that patient. Many risks, obviously, from that. So I don't know that it's
Were any of
not.
those in natal males?
Just females.
Just
yeah.
females, yeah.
So.
I mean, I think though, we have to educate people at some point. So I had someone ask me, well, I heard that, potentially cells from the spine could be removed and then turned into, sperm later in life. So I think all of us working in this field know that we didn't know maybe 20 years ago where the technology was going to be today, but I also think we have a responsibility to tell patients and families when we think something is unlikely to work for them, because we don't want to provide false hope. And I think to Lisa's point, I think it is tricky. So, I mean, number one, with this not being free, so some contraception we can get for free, right? So that the financial burden isn't there. In this case, the patient needs their parents. But I think we both know it gets really complicated with when to consider the parents' wishes and not. Is it the patient's right to pursue fertility preservation? Is it the patient's right to decline fertility preservation? And what do the parents' role in that, and at what age does that shift?
So last case, and I think probably the most challenging, again, doesn't involve a cancer diagnosis, but involves a patient who's going to be receiving gonadotrophic treatment. So Richard is 25. He's diagnosed with lupus, and also his whole life been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. He's living with his girlfriend who has moderate cognitive impairment, and for those of you who don't know, that's typically based on IQ. If your IQ was in a certain range, you're mild, moderate, severe, and there may even be profound, categories. So these people, as a couple, are not living on their own and are not capable of living on their own completely. They live with Sasha's family. Richard doesn't have any communication with his family. They say that as a couple, they've always wanted to have children, and it was explained to him prior to receiving information about the treatment he would get for lupus that it could impair his fertility, and he was asked if he wanted to bank sperm, and he definitely wanted to, and his girlfriend wanted to, but the parents said, no, we can't afford this, and we are essentially raising them. They are dependent upon us to do this, but technically he's an adult, and he does other things. He doesn't drive a car, but he rides the bus and he goes to a job. He does do some things independently. And the parents said it would be horrifying for us if a pregnancy occurred, because that would be another person for us to take care of, and we're getting older. But he very much, wanted to do this. So what do you think?
Have these parents taken over other legal decision-making rights? So are they allowed to make other medical decisions? Can they sign a contract? All those sorts of things. And it seems to me that if they have not taken over other legal decision-making, that reproductive health should not necessarily be taken. I mean, can he sign consent for his lupus treatment?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I think that they had not. I think that they had no legal documents in place in terms of that, he was living with them but didn't have communication with his own family. I mean, it was financially supporting them.
Barb, have you seen patients with mild CI in your practice?
This is often an issue in the pediatric population that comes up when I'm counseling families whose children have brain tumors. And, the radiation can leave them with significant cognitive impairment, and it's a big what if for families. And I have noticed over the last 5-6 years that the pendulum is swinging, where parents used to say no, not at all, and now I am seeing them say we need to consider this. We don't know what the future holds, but we still need to consider it.
Yeah, so really challenging, and I want to just switch really quickly to put a plug in for our training where we don't answer any of those questions, but can maybe help arm the allied health professional with some broader information about communication skills. So if you're interested in this, we're still taking applications, nurses, psychologists, physicians, assistants, and social workers. And I really want to thank, this slide wasn't big enough to hold all of the people who've been involved in what was once Enrich and is now Echo, in this training. So we have a whole host of people who provide lectures, who come and do video demonstrations with standardized patients. And as we learn at this conference, we go back and say, okay, now we need to update this, and we need to change that, and we need to call that person to come do a presentation for us. So this is, I get far more out of the little that I may give to be here. So, but with that said, I want to leave you with this last slide. Teresa and her group coined oncofertility and many other terms that are now in the nomenclature of our discussions about this. Is it time for us to come up with a new term that encompasses these broad groups who have autoimmune disorders, who have DSD, intersex, transgender? Do we need a term that separates us from people who might do social egg freezing or other forms of fertility preservation, such as those who are who are in the military and going overseas, who were all offered fertility preservation? And what could some of this term be? Is it possible to come up with a term that fits everything? So here's some things that various people have explained or have offered. Frozen hope, future hope, fertility forward, F squared for future fertility, F to the third power, future for fertility, people's fertility, and the one I like, FU, fertility upward or fertility united. And I'm sure as a group we could come up with a lot of these terms, and maybe not now in these next couple of minutes, but maybe that'll be our challenge by the time we come back next year, is to have a discussion about should there be a group term and what should it be. Thank you.